Before we drift back through time tonight, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? A quiet room, a cold night, maybe somewhere warm while we talk about frozen winters? Leave a comment and let me know. I read them all while the fire burns low. Now, let's step into the past. The year begins with a sigh, not a song. In medieval Europe, winter isn't just a season, it's a test that never asks nicely. The first frost arrives like an announcement from a higher power that warmth was a privilege, not a right. Fields turn to stone. Rivers freeze mid-argument. And every person, from the humblest shepherd to the loudest noble, learns again that survival is not guaranteed. Snow makes everything equal. It covers the castle and the cottage with the same indifference, softening edges that hunger will soon sharpen again. Inside, the world shrinks to the radius of a hearth fire. You live in that circle of light, counting logs like a miser counts coins. The smell of burning wood becomes the scent of existence itself. Everything you own either smokes, freezes, or breaks. Roof beams creak with frost. Bread hardens overnight into a weapon. People wake with ice on their blankets and call it good sleep, because at least they woke at all. Outside, the countryside goes silent except for crows and the occasional wolf. Roads vanish under drifts. Traders stay home. The market square becomes a white, empty stage where only the wind performs. Villages turn inward. Gossip is rationed like grain. For the poor, winter means calculation. How many days left until the last onion shrivels? How much ale remains in the cask? How far to stretch the salted fish before Lent arrives to forbid it anyway? For the wealthy, it means endurance of a different kind. Too many guests trapped indoors, too many fires to feed, too many reminders that their thick walls are still only stone between them and the endless cold. Even the church bells sound different in winter, slower, heavier, as if the air itself resists the idea of noise. Priests preach about patience, faith, and the virtue of suffering while secretly hoping God appreciates irony. And yet, people still find ways to live inside the cold. Children chase each other across frozen ponds until one inevitably falls in, granting the village its yearly sermon on consequences. Lovers meet in barns that smell of hay and frost. Mothers hum lullabies that are half prayer, half weather forecast. Winter doesn't destroy medieval Europe. It shapes it, hammering habit into ritual, turning necessity into culture. Every candle lit in the dark is a small rebellion, and every loaf of bread shared before it molds is a victory. When the first true snow falls, it's beautiful for about 10 minutes. Then it becomes a problem to solve. Paths vanish. Livestock wander off. The world turns white, and white means work. Every morning, someone must break the ice on the well with an axe. Someone must dig a path to the latrine. Someone must scrape frost off the inside of the church windows just so God can see the faithful. The cold doesn't care about piety. Priests catch chilblains just like peasants. Monks in their drafty stone cells learn that divine inspiration is easier to achieve when one's ink isn't frozen solid. Even the holy water becomes more solid theology than liquid blessing. Food defines the season more than faith. The pantry is a measure of time, a dwindling calendar of salted meat, dried peas, and roots that look increasingly like ideas rather than meals. The poor rely on what they call pottage, a stew that can contain anything that didn't escape fast enough. It's reheated daily until it becomes less food than ritual. The saying goes, if you can still chew it, it isn't ready yet. Bread is life, and bread is constant trouble. Flour clumps with damp, oven smoke, and yeast behaves like a drunk, unpredictable and easily offended. Bakers are both essential and despised because their success reminds everyone else how little they have. And when the grain runs out, people grind acorns or bark or whatever shame the forest offers. Winter turns animals into currency. A live chicken is better than silver. A cow is a fortune on legs, provided you can keep it alive through February. People sleep in the same room as their livestock, not out of affection but out of shared need. The warmth of a single cow can mean the difference between comfort and death, between breathing and not. Then comes the real cruelty, the light. Or rather, the lack of it. Days shrink until you forget what the sun looks like without clouds smothering it. You wake in darkness, work in darkness, eat in darkness, and the candle that gives you company also eats your wealth. Wax and tallow become small luxuries, so nights stretch long and mean. It's said that more sins are committed in winter, not from temptation, but from boredom. Inside the castle halls, things are no less strange. Nobles host endless feasts to prove they aren't cold, even though their wine freezes between toasts. They entertain themselves with minstrels, games, and petty arguments. Someone always gets drunk enough to try jousting indoors. Someone always regrets it. Outside, the peasants listen to the echo of those feasts from miles away, the faint laughter of people who don't need to care how long the woodpile lasts. Yet even in that bitterness, they know one truth: the rich freeze slower, but they still freeze. Winter is the one time when the world forgets its hierarchies. Frost on a crown and frost on a thatched roof are the same color. The poor might envy the powerful, but the snow doesn't. It falls evenly, a democratic misery. When the wind changes, it brings voices. Not human ones, the kind that scrape through the cracks in shutters and make you wonder if the forest remembers your name. The wind in winter is half weather, half rumor. It tells people that God is displeased, that witches are busy, that maybe, just maybe, spring won't come this year. Folklore thrives in the dark months. When work slows and hunger grows, imagination becomes the only form of warmth everyone can afford. In cottages lit by a single flame, families whisper stories about spirits that wander the snowdrifts, headless monks seeking lost prayers, and the devil disguised as a traveler asking to share your fire. Children listen wide-eyed, pretending not to shiver. The tales make the fear easier to manage. If something has a name, you can at least curse it. Across the villages, winter superstition becomes a kind of public entertainment. People throw salt on thresholds to keep demons out, hang herbs from rafters to stop illness, and carve crude charms into wooden spoons. Somewhere between desperation and faith, magic becomes practical. Even priests who condemn such foolishness carry a lucky stone in their pocket, just in case. But it isn't just fear that grows in winter. It's sickness. Cold air and close quarters are a marriage made in fever. Smoke from hearths clogs lungs. Diets heavy on salt and barley leave the body brittle. If one person coughs, a dozen soon follow. The doctor, if the village even has one, will recommend rest, prayer, and maybe bleeding, a combination that treats everything except the cause. In towns, the streets become more dangerous as ice turns to mirror and filth freezes just long enough to look solid. People fall, curse, and laugh because laughing burns calories they can't afford. The poor gather near bakeries, drawn by the smell of bread they won't taste. The desperate steal coal from monks or wood from their neighbors and then confess about it later, when the thaw makes guilt more bearable. Meanwhile, the church keeps its calendar. Winter is filled with saints' days and fasts that make little sense to empty stomachs. On paper, fasting is holy restraint. In practice, it's just an extension of poverty with divine permission. Lent arrives like a cosmic joke, 40 days of abstinence when there was barely anything to eat anyway. And yet, through all of it, people still find ways to make beauty out of endurance. They sing while threshing grain. They carve small wooden toys for children who don't believe in abundance but still believe in kindness. Even misery, repeated long enough, turns into art. By midwinter, the snow is no longer white. It's gray with ash, trampled straw, and the secrets of too many nights. But the people who survive this far have learned the rhythm. The cold will not kill them if they stay moving, if they keep their humor sharp, if they remember that every story told by firelight is a promise, that the world, for all its cruelty, will turn again. By the middle of January, even hope has frostbite. Everything smells faintly of smoke and cabbage. The roads between villages are nothing more than frozen scars. Travelers vanish in them and reappear as stories. Messengers bring word of wars that paused for winter and will resume when generals remember how to move armies through mud. The rivers lock themselves in ice. Mill wheels stop turning, and with them, the small economies that keep towns alive. A village that relied on grain ground downstream must now grind its teeth instead. The blacksmith's forge cools because no one can pay for nails when roofs are buried and horses lame. Trade, that fragile heartbeat of medieval life, slows to a crawl, then to silence. Winter makes everyone a philosopher. In the cold, people talk less and think more. The silence between church bells grows long enough to fit questions no one dares speak aloud. Why are we here? What did we do to deserve this? Why does the sun return at all? Priests give answers that sound rehearsed. The wind gives better ones, quieter, crueler, but honest. In noble houses, the same questions whisper behind tapestries. Rich fabrics can't hide damp walls. The servants sleep near the kitchen hearth because heat climbs no higher than the second step of the stairs. The lord of the manor paces his hall, calculating how long the stores of salt pork will last and pretending the rats are smaller than they are. Even luxury trembles when the firewood runs low. Entertainment becomes survival of the imaginative. Troubadours sing about summers that never were, lovers who don't age, and lands where grapes grow without tending. They are paid in bread, wine, or flattery, depending on the household's honesty. In some places, the local fool is the most valued man alive. His jokes a defense against despair. Far from castles, peasants fight their own war against monotony. They mend tools by candlelight, sharpen blades that won't be used for months, and count days by the level of the candle stub. They gamble with bones and coins, telling themselves it's for fun, not hunger. When tempers snap, there are brawls that end as suddenly as they begin. No one holds grudges long, they don't have the calories for it. In towns, night patrols carry lanterns to check for thieves, drunkards, or the unlucky frozen where they fell. The light swings across shuttered doors, illuminating a whole city trying not to move too much. Taverns are packed with smoke and tired laughter. The ale is weak, but the illusion of warmth is strong enough to last until morning. There's a strange beauty to it all, the way frost makes filth look holy, the way breath hangs in the air like a visible prayer. Even despair has rhythm here. The sound of a log splitting in half feels like punctuation in a sentence the world keeps rewriting every year. And though no one admits it aloud, there's a quiet pride in surviving another day. Not joy, that's too expensive, but a stubborn, silent satisfaction. The kind that makes you think maybe this is what humanity's best skill truly is. Not thriving, not conquering, but simply refusing to stop. When February drags itself into being, people stop pretending to like winter. Even the saints run out of patience. Candlemas comes, the festival that promises light is returning, but the candles are short, the prayers are long, and the cold hasn't noticed the date. It's the cruelest month, a thief dressed as a messenger. You can see spring in the distance and still die before it gets there. By now, hunger has teeth. The best grain is gone, the ale is sour, and what's left in the pantry would make rats file complaints. The peasants stretch their meals thinner than the ice on a puddle. A soup can feed 10 if everyone is polite enough not to chew too loudly. The lucky ones have root cellars. The unlucky ones have excuses. Illness spreads with the same efficiency as gossip. Coughs echo from one cottage to another. Fevers take whole families and return them as memories. The village healer's bag is lighter with every visit. Fewer herbs, more hope. Hope is free, and therefore it's the most prescribed medicine in Europe. But even in this hard season, there's mischief. People need celebration the way plants need sunlight. Carnivals bloom out of nowhere, wild and short-lived as sparks. Masks, music, drunkenness, all in defiance of reason. They dance in the snow until their fingers go numb, pretending they are immortal for a night. When the church disapproves, the people laugh harder. Faith might rule the soul, but winter rules the body, and the body wants warmth, not sermons. Inside monasteries, the cold turns prayer into endurance training. The monks wake in darkness to chant psalms that sound like sighs. Their ink freezes, they hold the parchment close to the candle and scorch the corners without caring. Silence is their discipline, but even they curse quietly when their sandals stick to the icy floor. The novice who complains learns fast. Humility is easier to practice when your nose isn't running. And yet, among all this discomfort, something extraordinary happens. People begin to imagine spring again, not as fantasy, but as a plan. They patch clothes, clean tools, and whisper about the first plowing. The frost still rules, but its grip is weaker, its edges less sharp. A few brave souls dig through the snow to check for green shoots. When they find none, they say they found one anyway. The sound of dripping begins. It's small, almost apologetic, but it's the most beautiful noise anyone's heard in months. Water means Thor, Thor means mud, and mud means life is crawling back. The fields still look dead, but there's movement underneath, worms, roots, and the first insult hurled by a farmer who dares to hope again. The season hasn't ended, not yet. There will be more frost, more hunger, and at least one more good storm before it's over. But something inside the people shifts. They've survived another winter. They've buried some, mourned many, and laughed in defiance of the rest. They don't call it victory. They just call it March. The thaw comes not with trumpets but with leaks. Roofs that held all winter begin to drip in a steady rhythm, each drop a reminder that nothing man-made lasts as long as the cold. Floors turn slick, straw rots, and every corner smells of damp. Still, no one complains. After months of smoke and frost, the scent of melting snow feels like forgiveness. Paths reappear, first as lines of mud, then as roads again. Carts creak, dogs bark, and children run without slipping for the first time in months. It's chaos, but it's living chaos, which is infinitely better than the frozen kind. With the thaw comes reckoning. The dead must be buried properly. Those who died in the deep freeze were often left in barns or cellars until the ground softened enough to take them. Now, the churchyards fill. The bells ring so often that their sound becomes the background noise of spring. Death doesn't shock anyone here, it's just another season's tax. The survivors begin the slow arithmetic of rebuilding. Grain stores are inventoried, livestock counted, tools inspected. Nothing is ever quite enough. There's always one missing ox, one broken plow, one roof beam that finally surrendered to gravity. But the work feels different now, not desperate, just familiar. Survival is a trade, and everyone's an apprentice. Markets open again, muddy and loud. Traders from far towns arrive with carts full of color, dried fruits, wool, spices, things that smell like somewhere else. People who haven't smiled since Michaelmas suddenly remember how. Deals are struck with handshakes and lies. Both are accepted as currency. The cold has left marks deeper than frostbite. Some have gone half blind from smoke, others half mad from hunger. Many more are simply thinner, their laughter quieter, but it's laughter nonetheless. The cruelest part of winter isn't its danger, it's how quickly people learn to live without hope and how slowly they learn to let it back in. In monasteries, the brothers clean soot from their walls and open shutters for the first time since Advent. Light floods in like an uninvited guest, showing every crack and cobweb the dark had hidden. They squint, mutter blessings, and smile in spite of themselves. Even the abbot allows an extra ladle of broth in silence. The land begins to move again. Fields turn from white to brown, and farmers poke at them like suspicious detectives. If the earth yields, the year might be kind. If not, there will be more graves come next Candlemas. But for now, the frost loosens its hold, and the people exhale. At night, the stars look sharper. The sky no longer feels like a lid but a window. Someone, somewhere, plays a fiddle badly. Someone else laughs. The first frog croaks from a ditch, and every heart in the village turns toward the sound like a compass finding north. They survived. Again. Not because of faith or luck or cleverness, but because that's what humans do when the world insists they shouldn't. They stay. They build. They light another fire. Spring doesn't arrive all at once. It drips in slowly, like an apology the world isn't sure it owes. The snow retreats in patches, leaving behind a landscape that looks both reborn and diseased, gray, wet, full of the smell of old smoke and rot. But to medieval eyes, it's paradise. There's color again, faint and trembling but real, green moss, brown earth, a bird foolish enough to sing before dawn. The first task of spring is gratitude, though it rarely looks like joy. People clean. Not because they like it, but because filth is the one thing winter never takes away. Cottages are scrubbed, straw replaced, walls scraped of soot that tells a whole biography in layers of black. Brooms work like confession, the penance for surviving. Then comes the work that decides whether they'll survive the next winter. The fields are plowed, but the plows have splintered handles, and the oxen are half-starved. Seeds are precious, planting them feels like a gamble with fate. Each furrow cut into the earth is a prayer with blisters. The village watches the horizon like it's waiting for an answer. Festivals return, though cautiously. May Day feels almost indecent after months of gloom. People dance as if they need permission. They drink too much, sing too loud, and end up asleep in the mud with grins they forgot they had. The church frowns on it, of course, but even priests understand that holiness is easier to preach when people aren't starving. By now, the winter stories have already turned into jokes. What was terror in December is comedy in April. The night the well froze solid becomes a tale told for laughs. The morning a man found ice inside his boots becomes legend. Memory is the only warmth that grows stronger after the fire goes out. Travel resumes. Peddlers, minstrels, pilgrims, all the restless souls of Europe set out again. The roads, half-melted and treacherous, fill with motion and mud. Inns reopen. Taverns restock. The sound of hammers and hooves replaces the eerie silence of frost. The continent exhales, and civilization, such as it is, remembers itself. Yet the people never forget the cold. They talk about it the way sailors talk about storms, half in awe, half in dread. Winter is their yearly reminder that the world doesn't owe them mercy. It's also their proof that they can survive without it. Every scar, every wrinkle, every superstition is a receipt from nature, proof of payment in full. Some nights, when the air still bites, old fears stir again. Someone hears the cry of a fox and swears it's a soul lost in the snow. Someone else throws another log on the fire, just in case the darkness wants to renegotiate. But mostly, they laugh. The fire crackles, the ale is warm, and for the first time in months, nobody's counting candles. Outside, the stars look like thawed embers scattered across the sky. Tomorrow will bring more work, more hunger, more foolish hope. But for tonight, there's company, and that's enough. Summer always pretends to erase winter, but it never quite manages it. The land blooms, the rivers loosen, and for a few weeks, it's easy to believe the past was only a bad dream. But the scars remain, the roofs patched with mismatched timber, the faces drawn a little thinner, the graves in the churchyard multiplying like a second harvest. Yet summer brings its own kind of urgency. The memory of hunger turns every warm day into work. The fields must be plowed, planted, weeded, harvested, all before the next frost sneaks over the horizon. The peasants move through their tasks like soldiers who know the war isn't over, only paused. Each sheaf of grain tied and stacked is a tiny insurance policy against the future. The nobles, too, remember. They store grain obsessively, counting barrels in the dark, muttering numbers as if arithmetic could ward off fate. Those who ran short the previous winter make a public show of generosity now, feeding their tenants not out of kindness but as an investment in loyalty. Charity and strategy share the same table. Meanwhile, in the monasteries, scribes take advantage of the light. Their ink flows freely again, filling parchment with prayers, chronicles, and lists of the dead. They record the weather, the harvests, the strange behavior of stars, anything that might help future generations understand why life sometimes seems to be a conversation with silence. The chronicles never say it aloud, but every monk who writes knows, the next great winter is only ever a few years away. In the towns, life explodes. Fairs reopen, ships arrive, and the smell of markets replaces the odor of smoke and wet wool. Minstrels sing songs that pretend the world has always been kind. Children chase dogs through the mud, lovers sneak into barns, and taverns overflow with noise. For a brief moment, humanity forgets its lesson. And yet, under the laughter, there's an understanding. Every loaf of bread carries a whisper of the cold that once made bread sacred. Every mug of ale remembers the silence of January nights. Even in abundance, people move with the humility of survivors. Then, when the first leaves begin to yellow, the conversation starts again. Farmers talk about firewood. Women dry herbs and hang them in bundles from the rafters. The same old rituals, the same careful panic. The wheel turns, as it always has, and everyone pretends to be surprised. The last markets before winter are the loudest, a final performance before the curtain drops. Merchants shout, bells ring, coins clatter. But if you listen closely, beneath the chaos, you can hear something softer, the quiet gratitude of a people who know the season's cruelty by heart and still choose to meet it again. Because that's what medieval life really was, not a tragedy, not even a test, but a long, cold negotiation between humanity and the weather. A reminder written in frost that endurance, not comfort, is the truest form of civilization. Autumn always lies. It arrives dressed like a promise, gold leaves, full barns, cool air that feels like mercy, and whispers that maybe, just maybe, this year will be different. People want to believe it. The fields are full, the granaries creak with grain, and the sky glows soft as butter. For a few short weeks, even the poorest souls in the village can imagine they've outsmarted the cold. But beneath the beauty is dread. Every falling leaf is a countdown. The wind carries the smell of smoke again, not celebration now, but preparation. In every house, someone is drying herbs, mending cloaks, checking the roof for leaks that could become disasters. The woodcutters work from dawn to dusk, swinging axes in a rhythm that sounds suspiciously like prayer. The wealthy call it the season of gathering. The poor call it the season of remembering. Everyone remembers the year the snow came early, the year the grain spoiled, the year the river froze solid before the last ferry crossed. Memory is the one thing medieval Europe never runs short of. In the monasteries, the bells mark shorter and shorter days. The monks begin their winter fasting early, partly out of devotion and partly because the gardens are bare. They know that once Advent comes, the silence will thicken, and even the candles will seem colder. Superstition grows like mold in autumn's damp corners. People hang charms over doorways and mutter blessings at strangers. Every crow on a fence post becomes an omen, every storm cloud is an argument between saints. Women gather at wells and whisper weather predictions with the same solemnity as prophecy. They're often wrong, but no one dares say so, they've been right too many times about worse things. The harvest festivals are the last real laughter of the year. They eat until the food runs out, drink until the songs lose their meaning, and dance until the ground is more mud than earth. Children play with lanterns made from hollowed turnips, glowing faces to scare away the dark. Somewhere in that wild celebration is a quiet desperation, as if joy itself were fuel to burn against the coming cold. By November, the air has teeth again. Frost curls along the windows, and people speak in shorter sentences, not from lack of words but from the need to save their breath. The first snow doesn't fall so much as it descends, deliberate and silent, covering the world like an old debt come due. Those who survived last winter know exactly what to do. The same motions, the same fears, the same prayers repeated into the dark. Yet even as the cold settles in again, they don't give up. No one ever really does. Humanity's secret isn't strength or faith, it's habit. They build fires, they share what they can, they wait. And as the snow buries everything once more, there's a strange peace in the repetition. The world has done this before. So have they. The first storm of the season never asks permission. It sweeps in from the north like a returning debt collector, all wind and noise and frozen air that tastes of iron. The villagers scramble. Doors are barred, shutters nailed shut, livestock dragged inside whether they want to come or not. The dogs howl, the children cry, and for a few hours, it feels like the world has been reduced to a single room and the sound of the wind trying to erase it. When morning comes, silence has replaced the storm. The snow lies thick as penance, the landscape blank and bright and merciless. People open their doors and see the world remade, familiar shapes softened, fences swallowed, roads erased. And then, quietly, they begin again. In every house, the same rituals repeat, fires coaxed from ash, bread thawed beside embers, water chipped from blocks of ice. The smallest acts feel like victories. To light a fire in that cold is to declare war on the void. The rich, of course, tell themselves it's romantic. Poets in castles write verses about purity, about how snow cleanses the soul. The peasants outside those walls would prefer less cleansing and more warmth. Still, even they admit the beauty of it. For a few short days, the world glitters like a promise no one believes in but everyone wants to keep. The days shrink fast. By midwinter, light feels like a rumor. People mark time by meals and chores, fetch water, mend clothes, pray, sleep, repeat. The routine is comfort, it keeps madness at bay. Too much thinking in winter is dangerous. The cold makes philosophers of everyone, and philosophy has never filled a stomach. Then come the long nights. You can measure them by the number of candles it takes to reach dawn. Candles are expensive, so most choose darkness instead. Families sit in silence, the fire whispering in the corner, each person lost in private thoughts they'll never voice. Outside, wolves prowl near the edges of the light, their eyes reflecting back the fire like old gods watching humans pretend they are still in charge. And yet, in the quiet, there's a strange kind of comfort. The walls creak like familiar ghosts, the wind hums its endless song, and the fire performs its little play of sparks and smoke. The world feels smaller, but not lonelier. There's a dignity in surviving quietly, without complaint, as if endurance itself were a form of grace. Christmas comes, a holy interruption. The churches fill with people smelling of smoke and candle wax. The hymns are weary but heartfelt. After the service, they share what they can: bread, ale, laughter that feels borrowed but real. Even the poorest houses have a scrap of celebration. It's less about joy and more about remembering that joy once existed. The snow falls again that night, covering the footprints that led to church, erasing all evidence of warmth. By morning, it's as if no one ever left their homes at all. But they did. And they will again. Because that's what winter is, a season that takes everything and still finds people foolish enough to greet it with fire and song. January returns like an old creditor who remembers your name and your debts. The world is locked in its deepest sleep now. The snow no longer falls, it simply waits, layered and heavy, muting every sound except the groan of wood under frost. Smoke rises from chimneys and bends low, pressed down by the weight of the air. It's too cold even for noise to travel far. People move slower, speak less, and eat without conversation. There's nothing new to say, the stories have all been told, the prayers already repeated. Even arguments seem wasteful, anger takes energy, and energy is for survival. Fires become the heart of everything. You can measure a household's fortune by the size of its flame. Children sit close enough to the hearth that their hair smells of smoke for weeks. Old people hover near it as if afraid it might slip away. The woodpile shrinks daily, and every log thrown on the fire feels like a confession: I was not prepared enough. Hunger is constant, but subtle. It doesn't shout anymore, it whispers. Meals shrink. Bowls are passed with polite restraint. Nobody says they're hungry, they just chew slower, stare longer at the pot, and make jokes that aren't funny. The poor gnaw on stale bread or peel thin shavings off smoked meat that's more memory than meal. Outside, the forests are full of traps. Rabbits, foxes, anything that moves becomes fair game. The church frowns on such hunting but conveniently forgets its own rules when the larder runs empty. Monks trudge through the snow in heavy robes, muttering prayers and setting snares like everyone else. Piety, after all, burns fewer calories than stew. Illness arrives quietly, carried on the same breath that fogs the windows. Coughs become music, fevers bloom like unwanted candles. Healers mix tonics of vinegar and herbs, then bless them as if that could hide their uselessness. Sometimes they work, not because of medicine, but because the patient's stubbornness outweighs the plague's patience. And through it all, the nights stretch on, endless and absolute. Stars glitter above frozen roofs, cruel and magnificent. Wolves cry from distant hills, and every dog in every village answers. The sound echoes like a conversation between hunger and fear. Inside, the people endure. They tell themselves it's nearly over. They say it every year, every week, every night. And somehow, by the time the words stop feeling true, the first signs of thaw arrive. Not warmth, not yet, but something gentler in the air. It's strange how survival feels less like triumph and more like habit. Nobody celebrates the endurance itself, they just accept it, like breathing or sin. And maybe that's the real miracle of medieval winter, not that people lived through it, but that they did so without ever expecting it to be easy. Outside, the moonlight glitters on the snow, a cold, silver applause for another night survived. By late January, the cold becomes a kind of religion. Everyone worships it differently. Some curse it, some endure it, and some bargain with it, as if winter were an old god who might spare you if you behave. The frost on the windows makes delicate patterns that look suspiciously like runes. Old women read them the way priests read scripture, nodding wisely at shapes no one else can see. The villagers begin to dream differently. Hunger changes the imagination. Bread and meat appear in sleep like divine visions. Waking up hurts, not because of disappointment, but because the air is sharp enough to wound. People joke that their dreams are the only place they are warm, and everyone laughs a little too sincerely. The churches fill again, not out of faith but because they are slightly less cold than home. Candles gutter in the drafts, the wax drips like slow clocks. Sermons turn to endurance manuals. Patience is holy, the priest says, though his own nose is red and his voice cracks from the chill. Behind him, the stained glass glitters with summer scenes, fields and sunlight and blue skies, a cruel joke carved in color. In noble halls, the same frost creeps down the walls. The ladies wear layers of fur and velvet until they resemble furniture. Courtiers grumble that their wine freezes before it's drunk, so they switch to stronger spirits and pretend that was the plan all along. The great halls echo with forced laughter and the clink of goblets, but even the musicians' fingers are too stiff for joy. And then, without warning, something changes. A drip. Just one. The first drop of meltwater from a roof. It's a sound so small it almost feels imaginary, yet everyone hears it. Children point, adults smile in disbelief. The ice hasn't given up yet, but it's cracking. And the sound, that fragile, uncertain trickle, is more beautiful than any hymn. The thaw doesn't come all at once. It teases. One day of warmth, followed by 3 of spite. Mud replaces snow, and everyone remembers why they hated mud in the first place. But no one complains. Mud means movement. Mud means hope. The air changes first, it smells of damp earth instead of smoke. The birds return next, loud and chaotic, as if mocking the quiet that ruled for months. Dogs bark more, people shout more, and laughter travels farther. It's as if the whole world exhales. But the survivors know better than to trust it completely. Winter isn't gone, it's just watching from the tree line, waiting for one last chance to remind them who's in charge. So they keep their fires burning a little longer, just in case. Still, the world feels lighter. The frost on the windows thins, the sky brightens, and the sun lingers a little longer each day. It's not warmth yet, but it's the promise of it, and promises, in the Middle Ages, are the closest thing to miracles most people ever see. The thaw brings its own kind of trouble. What was beautiful when frozen now rots. The snow retreats like a guilty thief, revealing everything it covered. Bones of animals, scraps of forgotten tools, sometimes bodies the ground was too hard to claim earlier. Death looks different in the sunlight. It's not tragic anymore, just part of the scenery. The rivers wake up angry. Ice breaks in sheets, crashes downstream, and floods the lowlands. Whole fences vanish, bridges snap like twigs, and the smell of wet earth becomes overwhelming. But the people don't panic. They stand by the water's edge, nodding, as if they expected this argument between winter and spring. They've learned not to interfere when gods fight. Villages turn into construction sites. Roofs are patched, ditches redug, fences rebuilt. The children help because they want to, the adults because they have to. The sound of hammering and shouting replaces the eerie quiet of the cold months. It's chaos, but it's a lively kind of chaos, the music of survival played with splinters and mud. Even the animals change. Cows bellow for pasture, pigs escape and come back caked in mud, chickens lay again. The whole countryside hums with rude, messy life. And with that life comes gossip, endless, glorious gossip. Who lost what, who shared bread, who didn't. It's like watching civilization restart itself from memory. In the monasteries, the thaw means work. The gardens must be resown, the cellars cleaned, the manuscripts checked for mold. The brothers grumble, but they do it anyway. The rhythm of labor is a kind of prayer, and prayer is easier when it has a purpose. They record the weather carefully, noting each date and temperature. The frost broke on St. Cuthbert's Day, one writes. The river rose 3 cubits and spared us. It's not poetry, but it's history, and history is how you tell yourself that suffering had meaning. For a brief time, the nights are kind again. Fires burn low without fear, children sleep without coughing, and lovers meet under skies that no longer bite. The moon looks friendlier now that it's reflected in puddles instead of ice. People smile more. They even sing, Not loudly, not confidently, but enough that you can hear it from house to house like a slow return of courage. By late March, the land is ready to start again. Plows carve through the softened soil, and the air smells alive. Men call to oxen, women scatter seed, and everyone pretends they don't remember how thin they were 2 months ago. Hope isn't loud, it's practical. It comes in the shape of a furrow, a loaf, a candle not yet lit. And so, winter ends the only way it ever does, not with celebration, but with work. No one announces it. The snow leaves quietly, the same way it arrived, and the people move forward because there's nowhere else to go. Somewhere in the distance, the first thunder of spring rolls across the fields. The peasants look up, half fearful, half grateful. Rain, they know, means life. Even if it floods the roads again. By April, the countryside looks half-healed and half-haunted. The fields are alive again, but the forests still hold their ghosts. You can smell the thaw, earth, smoke, and something faintly sweet, like memory. The rivers, once solid and silent, chatter endlessly as if trying to make up for months of stillness. Every sound feels louder now, the creak of carts, the bark of dogs, the splash of hooves in mud. The world, at last, has found its voice again. People speak more too. They linger in doorways, trade news across fences, laugh about how long the winter lasted even though it always lasts the same amount of time. Forgetting is part of survival. The human mind softens the edges of suffering, sanding it down until it becomes a story instead of a wound. That's how you endure centuries, by misremembering just enough. The first harvest of greens appears, timid and miraculous. Onions, leeks, herbs, flavors that taste like color. The poor eat them raw, too impatient to cook. The wealthy have them stewed and served on silver platters, pretending the world owes them warmth. For a few brief weeks, no one starves, and no one complains. Travel begins again in earnest. Merchants roll carts full of salt and cloth through muddy roads. Pilgrims appear like crows, clutching staffs, muttering prayers, and asking for directions to shrines that may not exist anymore. Soldiers, newly unemployed after a winter truce, march toward someone else's war. All of Europe seems to move, restless as the thawed rivers. But the shadow of winter never fully leaves. Every act of joy feels cautious, like a child touching a hot stove. When someone laughs too loud, another will mutter, "Don't tempt the cold." It's not superstition, it's memory pretending to be wisdom. The monasteries record it all, the floods, the diseases, the omens seen in clouds. The chroniclers never sound surprised. The people suffered greatly, one might write, but they endured, as is their custom. That single line covers everything: hunger, frostbite, death, and yet, in its brevity, it captures the truth. Endurance was their culture. By May, flowers bloom even on graves. Sheep wander freely again, their bells ringing like small, clumsy hymns. Children chase them, laughing, until someone reminds them to be careful near the river. Every generation learns the same lessons in the same mud. Evenings are warmer now. The fires burn smaller, more for comfort than necessity. The stars return, not as warnings of cold but as ornaments. People sit outside again, wrapped in cloaks, drinking what's left of the ale. Someone always says, "It was worse last year." Someone else nods, even if it wasn't true. It's the kind of lie that keeps the world turning. And beneath the warmth, the earth remembers, layers of frost buried under layers of soil, ready to rise again when the time comes. Because it always comes. But that's not for tonight. Tonight, the fields hum with insects, the river whispers, and humanity, that strange, stubborn species, rests in the brief, golden illusion that the worst is over. By summer, winter feels like a rumor. The same fields that were gray and lifeless just months ago now shimmer with wheat and the hum of insects. The air is heavy with warmth, the kind that makes even hard labor feel like celebration. People who once huddled around a single flame now work beneath a sun that feels too generous, as if trying to make up for all it withheld. The villagers laugh more. Children run barefoot through the dust, their laughter echoing where silence once ruled. Even the old smile, though it's a slow, tired smile that knows better than to trust the weather. Still, there's no rest. Summer isn't leisure, it's preparation disguised as abundance. Every sheaf of grain must be cut, every loaf baked, every cellar filled. The work is relentless, and yet, no one dares complain. Complaints are for the cold months when words are cheap. In summer, everything is an investment in survival. Feasts return, not the desperate ones of winter but loud, messy celebrations that smell of roasted meat and ale. The peasants eat as if daring the world to take it back. The nobles host tournaments, watching armored men chase glory in the heat while they sit in shaded galleries, fanning themselves and pretending nobility isn't just expensive boredom. But beneath the laughter and the sweat, everyone counts. How much grain in the granary? How much salt in the barrel? How much wood in the pile? No one says it aloud, but the fear of the next winter lurks like a shadow behind the sunlight. It's a quiet, collective superstition. If you work hard enough now, maybe the cold will show mercy later. The church bells ring louder in summer. Weddings, births, baptisms, the season of beginnings. Yet every ceremony carries the faint echo of endings. Parents bless their newborns and secretly pray they'll survive the first frost. Lovers wed in fields of flowers, knowing they'll soon turn to stubble and snow. Even joy is tempered by memory. In the monasteries, the monks record the season's blessings. The harvest was abundant, one writes. Thanks be to God. Between the lines, you can almost hear the quill hesitate, as if even God shouldn't be trusted to keep his promises too long. At night, the air cools, and the stars return in their summer clarity. The people sit outside and tell stories. Always the same ones, about saints, about beasts, about winters long past. And in every tale, no matter how old or embellished, there's always that moment when the frost arrives, and the people endure. It's never the end of the story. Just a pause before the next thaw. When autumn's edge creeps into the wind again, they barely react. They've lived this loop too long to pretend it surprises them. They gather the grain, stack the firewood, salt the meat. The work of survival begins again, quiet and precise, as natural as breathing. Winter will come, and they'll curse it. Then they'll survive it. Then they'll forget, for a while, and tell themselves that next time will be easier. It never is. But it's the lie that keeps them human. In winter, faith becomes visible. You can see it in the breath that clouds the air when the priest speaks, in the trembling hands that hold a candle too close to numb fingers. The churches of medieval Europe were never warm. Stone walls held the cold like memory, and sermons were as much about endurance as salvation. The faithful came anyway. Wrapped in wool, shivering under cloaks, they knelt on icy floors and whispered their confessions into the chill. The sound of prayer mingled with the creak of wood and the flutter of birds nesting in the rafters. It smelled of tallow, damp wool, and faint desperation. Winter turned religion into theater. A procession through the snow was an act of courage, a midnight mass, an ordeal. The priests spoke of eternal fire, and the people half hoped for it, if only to feel warm again. Bells rang through the frozen air, their echoes bouncing between houses like reminders that life continued, if only barely. Faith wasn't comfort, it was structure. It told people when to fast, when to feast, when to pretend that suffering meant something. And in winter, structure was survival. Without it, the days would blur, the cold would creep in deeper, and madness would find the cracks. The monasteries were the soul of this frozen world. Monks rose before dawn to chant into darkness. Their breath hung like incense, and their voices echoed against stone too vast to ever feel full. They copied manuscripts with trembling fingers, their ink thick with grit from half-frozen wells. Every page finished was a victory, every letter proof that persistence mattered more than comfort. But even the holy faltered. There were winters when the bread ran out and fasting became starvation, when faith looked suspiciously like hunger in disguise. And yet they kept chanting, kept praying, kept recording the cold as if God himself needed a diary. The people believed because they had to. In a world where food and fire were never certain, belief was the only thing that didn't freeze. It was the one warmth that couldn't be stolen. Every medieval village had someone who claimed to know how to fight the cold, not the kind outside, but the one that crept into bones and lungs and refused to leave. She might be called a healer, a wise woman, a midwife, or, when the church got nervous, a witch. Whatever the title, she was the one people turned to when the frost took hold. Medicine in winter was equal parts desperation and theater. If you coughed, they bled you, because clearly your body had too much blood. If your joints ached, they burned herbs, prayed to Saint Apollonia, and told you to stop angering the wind. Most cures involved wine, not because it worked, but because being slightly drunk made death feel polite enough to wait outside for a while. For the wealthy, winter illness was an inconvenience. For the poor, it was prophecy. Every cough might be your last. The village healer mixed honey, vinegar, ashes, and ground roots, muttering charms that sounded half like Latin and half like pleading. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes people recovered. And when they didn't, well, she had a charm for the soul, too. Doctors, the university-trained sort, didn't fare much better. They wrapped patients in furs and herbs, insisting warmth could be restored by the proper balance of humors. The theory was elegant, useless, and wildly profitable. A nobleman could die comfortably under 3 blankets and a Latin prayer, convinced that knowledge itself was keeping him alive. The monks had their own methods. Their gardens grew medicine even in the dead of winter, dried nettle for blood, sage for strength, garlic for courage. They boiled broths so pungent that the smell alone could frighten fever into retreat. Between prayers, they documented every success and failure, as if writing could heal what herbs could not. But the truth was simple: winter didn't care about knowledge or faith. It killed by patience. No fever, no wound, just the slow grinding exhaustion of bodies using themselves as fuel. When people spoke of miracles, they didn't mean the blind seeing or the lame walking. They meant waking up after a week of coughing and realizing you still could. And yet, medicine wasn't hopeless. It was proof of defiance. Every remedy, no matter how absurd, fox fat, leeches, holy water, or burnt bread, was an act of rebellion against the cold's authority. The sick rooms glowed with dim candlelight, shadows swaying across faces that looked half dead already. Someone always whispered, "God will provide." Someone else stirred another pot, hoping he'd hurry. And sometimes, impossibly, the sick lived. Not because of the leeches or the prayers, but because people refused to stop caring for them. Compassion, after all, was the one medicine that worked even when it shouldn't. Medieval people didn't eat for pleasure in winter. They ate to negotiate with death. Every meal was an argument: a pot of boiling pottage against the cold, a loaf of bread against despair. Still, they found moments of joy, and that might be the strangest miracle of all, the laughter that survived the frost. The church calendar ruled the table as much as the weather. Advent, then Christmas, then Lent, each with its rules, its punishments, its tiny, holy loopholes. The rich cheated constantly. Nobles declared beaver tails were fish, so they could eat meat during fasts. The poor declared survival was permission enough. They cooked whatever moved slower than they did. Fasting wasn't just piety, it was logistics disguised as virtue. Food ran short every year, and the church cleverly turned necessity into holiness. "Eat less, and God will love you more," they said, as if heaven rationed mercy by the spoonful. People obeyed, not because they believed it, but because pretending turned hunger into purpose. Still, there were feasts. Trembling, reckless, glorious feasts. Christmas lasted 12 days, 12 days when even the poorest tried to forget what hunger was. Ale flowed, songs echoed, and candles burned long past midnight. For a few nights, the cold didn't win. The rich roasted swans and peacocks, their feathers reattached for decoration, beauty returned to the corpse. The poor boiled everything into stews thick enough to stand a spoon in. Both meals smelled of triumph. Then came the fasts again. Ash Wednesday reduced the world to penance. Lent meant no meat, no laughter, no music, or so the church said. People obeyed until sundown, then sang anyway. They danced quietly in barns, whispered jokes behind doors, drank sour ale and called it medicine. Sin was survival with better rhythm. Carnival, the last indulgence before Lent, was winter's rebellion. Villagers wore masks, mocked priests, swapped clothes, and drank like saints on holiday. For one day, the world flipped upside down. Servants became masters, fools became kings, and hunger became defiance. The next morning, they went to church, heads bowed, pretending they'd learned humility. But they hadn't. What they learned was better. That joy, even forbidden joy, was a weapon against despair. When the snow piled high again and silence fell, the songs lingered. Hummed softly while stirring soup, whispered in barns, tapped out on tables when no one was looking. Laughter carried warmth further than fire ever could. In the end, every winter feast was a sermon, not about faith, but about the stubbornness of life. You eat, you sing, you sin a little, and you promise to do better when the world thaws. The promise never lasts, but that's not the point. The point is that people keep making it. Winter, more than any other season, belonged to women. Not because it was gentle, it wasn't, but because it demanded patience, endurance, and quiet strength. Men swung axes and carried wood, but it was women who kept the fragile pulse of life beating behind the walls. Inside the cottage, everything revolved around the hearth, the heart, the altar, the battlefield. The fire had to stay alive, or nothing else would. Women guarded it like a secret. They fed it with scraps, fanned it with breath, and prayed over it like a child. In a world that measured wealth in warmth, they were the keepers of fortune. Birth didn't stop for winter. Babies arrived in blizzards, in barns, in the middle of nights so cold the midwives wept into their shawls. There were no sterile linens, no doctors, just strong hands, whispered prayers, and whatever light a single candle could spare. The cries of mothers and newborns echoed together, a duet of pain and proof. Sometimes both survived. Sometimes neither did. When they didn't, the women buried them quietly, wrapping the tiny bodies in cloth, tucking them near the churchyard fence so God could find them quickly. Then they went home and stirred the pot, because dinner still needed cooking. Grief waited its turn. Winter was hardest on the poor and cruelest to the women. Men could escape into work, the forest, the fields, the tavern, but women lived in rooms that never forgot sorrow. They watched children cough in their sleep and prayed for fever to pass. They stitched clothes from rags, boiled water that froze before it cooled, and made meals from nothing. They invented recipes that shouldn't exist, frost soup, bark broth, desperation stew, and somehow made them taste like love. They were the village memory, too. The ones who remembered which herbs cured the cough, which saints were merciful, which neighbors could be trusted when the food ran out. Men ruled by name, women ruled by knowing. And in winter, knowledge was power. Even the church, with all its hierarchy, knew better than to challenge that authority. Priests might bless the bread, but it was the women who baked it. And so, while the world outside froze, the women's world kept moving, stitching, stirring, soothing, surviving. When someone died, they prepared the body. When someone was born, they cut the cord. Life began and ended in their hands, and both acts were done with the same quiet reverence. They never called it power, but it was. Not the kind that writes history, but the kind that ensures there's still a history to write. When spring finally came, it was the women who noticed first. They saw the frost retreat from the window corners, felt the air soften, smelled the wet soil before anyone else dared to hope. And they smiled, not in relief, but in recognition. Winter was over. It always ended. They always made sure of it. If the church was where people went to survive the soul's winter, the tavern was where they went to survive the bodies. It was the one place in a medieval village where noise was allowed to fight the silence. The walls sweated from the heat of bodies packed too close, the smell of ale and wood smoke filling every corner. For a few hours, the cold outside stopped existing. The tavern wasn't elegant, it was a wooden box stuffed with noise, smoke, and laughter that had forgotten its manners. The ale was weak, the benches uneven, and the floor sticky enough to claim a shoe if you stood still too long. But to the people who filled it, it was paradise with splinters. Here, rank melted faster than snow. Peasants, traders, and soldiers all sat shoulder to shoulder, united by the great equalizer of ale. Nobles rarely entered, but when they did, they were just another man with frozen fingers and a thirst. Titles don't mean much when your breath fogs like everyone else's. The drinks were crude, brewed in barrels that doubled as furniture. The taste didn't matter, it was the warmth that counted. The first swallow burned, the second soothed, and by the third, the world seemed survivable again. Someone always brought a fiddle, someone else a drum, and the air would fill with music that felt ancient even as it was born. Laughter in winter sounded different. Louder, yes, but also more fragile, like glass trying to forget it's breakable. Every joke was a rebellion. Every song was a middle finger to the frost still waiting outside. There were fights, too, of course. Too much drink, too little patience, and the old resentments that slept lightly in the cold. Fists flew, benches broke, and blood mingled with ale on the floor. But even those brawls had rhythm, the rhythm of life refusing to die quietly. And then there was love, or something close enough to wear the name. Winter made people reckless, and the tavern gave them darkness to hide it in. Hushed conversations in corners, hands brushing beneath the table, promises that would melt faster than the next thaw. For some, it was sin. For others, warmth in its most honest form. At closing time, though time was a flexible concept, the crowd stumbled into the cold, laughing, singing, arguing. The night swallowed them one by one. The tavern keeper barred the door, counted coins, and stoked the last embers of the fire. Tomorrow, they'd come again. Tomorrow, the same faces, the same songs, the same hunger for heat. In a world that offered so little mercy, the tavern was proof that defiance could be loud, messy, and alive. For a few hours, it was enough to forget the saints, the frost, and the endless struggle between survival and surrender. Outside, the wind might still own the land, but for one night, the laughter had been louder. If peasants met winter with noise and taverns met it with ale, the monks faced it with silence. In the monasteries of medieval Europe, the cold wasn't an inconvenience, it was a test. Every breath hung in the air like a prayer, and every prayer was an act of defiance against the dark. The day began long before dawn, when the stars still shivered over the cloisters. The bell for matins rang through the frost, echoing off stone that hadn't felt warmth in months. The brothers rose from straw mattresses, wrapped themselves in wool robes stiff with chill, and shuffled through corridors lit by trembling candles. Their voices, when they sang, were soft but relentless, Latin verses meeting the winter air like mist. It wasn't music for pleasure, it was rhythm for survival. In the quiet, the chant became a heartbeat for the monastery itself. Work filled every hour the light allowed. Some tended the cattle, brushing frost from their hides. Others chopped wood until their hands cracked, or carried buckets from the half-frozen well. The scribes sat bent over parchment, ink thick as mud, writing words meant to outlive them all. Each letter was drawn with frozen fingers, the gospel of endurance written one shiver at a time. Meals were simple and small. Bread, broth, maybe a handful of dried peas. Silence was kept even at the table, broken only by the sound of chewing and the occasional clink of a wooden spoon. Conversation, like warmth, was a luxury they had chosen to surrender. And yet, in that silence, there was peace. Outside, the world clawed for survival. Inside, everything had a rhythm, a purpose. Each day was a small repetition of faith: wake, pray, work, eat, pray again, sleep. It was tedious, holy, and strangely comforting. Sometimes, the silence cracked. A novice would whisper a joke, or a tired brother would curse when ink spilled on a precious page. The abbot would frown, but even he knew the sound of laughter in winter was no sin. It was proof that the human heart still beat beneath all that obedience. In the coldest weeks, they opened their doors to travelers and beggars. The church demanded charity, and the monks obeyed, though it meant thinner bowls and colder nights. Still, they gave what they could: bread, ale, a place by the fire. For some guests, it was salvation. For others, a final kindness. When night fell, the chants returned. The brothers sang until their voices grew ragged, each note rising into the dark like smoke. The air smelled of tallow, sweat, and damp wool. No one complained. They believed the angels could hear them, and even if they couldn't, the sound comforted the living. In the monastery, winter was more than a season. It was a teacher. It stripped away everything that wasn't necessary: words, vanity, comfort, until only duty remained. And duty, unlike flesh, did not freeze. Every village in medieval Europe had a line it did not cross. Not marked on any map, not fenced or guarded, just understood. Beyond that line began the forest. In summer, it was a place of work and danger, a source of wood, berries, and superstition. In winter, it became something else entirely, a world of shadows and sounds, where reason froze faster than water. The forest in winter was not empty. It breathed. The trees groaned in the wind, branches cracking like bones. Snow muffled footsteps but amplified heartbeats. You could hear your own fear there, echoing back at you from the dark. Wolves ruled that world. Not the sleek, noble creatures of later romantic tales, but thin, desperate animals with ribs like cage bars. They followed the smell of villages, waited at the edge of fields, watched smoke rise from chimneys and wondered how long until hunger gave them courage. Every child in Europe grew up with wolf stories, and for good reason. When a cow vanished or a traveler didn't return, people said, the wolves took them. Sometimes, that was true. Sometimes, it was just easier to blame the beasts than the cold or the dark or human cruelty. Wolves were convenient villains, the embodiment of everything wild that refused to be tamed. But the forest held older fears, too. People whispered of spirits that walked the snow, white women who lured men into blizzards, ghostly hunters with flaming eyes, the howling souls of the unburied dead. Even priests avoided naming them. Better to let the forest keep its secrets. Still, some had to enter it. The woodcutters, the hunters, the desperate. They tied charms to their belts, murmured prayers to Saint Hubert or Saint Blaise, and stepped into the silence. Every sound, a snapping twig, a falling clump of snow, became an accusation. The deeper they went, the more the air seemed to thicken, as if time itself was watching. And yet, the forest provided. Wood for fire, meat for the pot, herbs hidden beneath frost. It was a place of death, yes, but also of mercy. Those who respected it survived. Those who didn't became stories. Villagers told tales by the half to keep children from wandering too far. The forest takes what it's owed, they'd say. And the children would nod solemnly, pretending to believe it was just a story. But when the wind blew through the trees and howled across the rooftops, no one, not even the adults, slept easily. In the deepest winter nights, when the snow glowed blue under the moon, the line between the village and the forest disappeared. Shadows stretched long across the fields, and the wolves sang their endless hymn. Inside, people prayed louder, as if faith could outshout hunger. The forest never answered. It didn't need to. Its silence was the oldest voice in the world. Winter turned the medieval road into a gamble. What was a muddy inconvenience in summer became, under frost, a corridor of quiet death. Snow covered the ruts and potholes, hiding traps that could break a wheel or a leg in one careless moment. Still, people walked them. They always did. The road, like hunger or faith, could not be resisted. The roads of winter belonged to the desperate and the holy, and sometimes, it was hard to tell which was which. Merchants trudged behind oxen-drawn carts, their goods wrapped in cloth and prayer. Pilgrims limped toward distant shrines, convinced that cold feet and blistered hands might buy them a little less time in purgatory. Soldiers moved, too, because wars didn't stop for weather, only paused long enough to grow meaner. The sound of travel was the same everywhere, the crunch of snow, the groan of wood, the muffled curses of men whose boots had frozen stiff. Even horses learned to hate the season. Their breath steamed in the air, nostrils crusted with ice, eyes dull with fatigue. The lucky ones made it to a monastery or an inn. The unlucky became landmarks, frozen shapes by the roadside that people passed without looking too closely. Travelers feared more than wolves and cold. They feared the silence, that eerie, endless quiet where the world seemed to have forgotten it contained life. The horizon offered no comfort, only a gray smear between white sky and white earth. To walk through that was to feel small in a way no prayer could fix. At night, the roads grew treacherous. Torches flickered and died in the wind. Those who could afford it stayed in inns, smoky rooms packed with strangers and lice, where the air smelled of sweat, beer, and old fear. Those who couldn't slept in barns, or not at all. Bandits waited even in winter, though the cold slowed their knives. Some wore the guise of monks, offering blessings that ended in theft. The poor traveler learned to fear charity as much as danger. But not all encounters were cruel. Sometimes, a peasant would open his door to a stranger and share the last crust of bread. Sometimes a passing pilgrim would give a relic, real or imagined, in gratitude. On roads like those, kindness was rare enough to be holy. The church kept records of travelers who died in winter, nameless pilgrims, wandering friars, beggars who froze mid-prayer. The scribes wrote their names if they had them, their causes if they didn't. Perished of cold upon the road, the margins said, as if that were explanation enough. And maybe it was. The road in winter asked only one question: how far will you go before you stop being human? Some answered with courage. Some with faith. Most, simply with motion. When spring returned, the roads thawed, revealing what winter had claimed. Bones, broken carts, the remains of journeys cut short. The living walked past them, eyes forward, because the road never ends, it only waits. A medieval castle in summer was a living thing. Banners fluttering, markets bustling, dogs barking, soldiers training in the yard. In winter, it turned into a tomb that refused to admit it was one. The same stones that promised safety also held the cold like vengeance. Every wall sweated frost, and every corridor whispered the same thought: you can't burn stone. The nobles pretended to enjoy it, of course. They wrapped themselves in fur, gathered near the great hearths, and declared the chill invigorating. They told stories of heroic ancestors enduring harsher winters, as if discomfort were a family tradition. But behind the bravado was the same quiet dread that haunted every peasant hovel, the knowledge that no amount of rank could outwit the cold. Servants suffered most. They rose before dawn to haul logs, carry water, scrub the soot from walls. The kitchens were both blessing and curse, warm, yes, but full of smoke, burns, and the endless demands of hungry lords. The cooks laid stews thick enough to fight frost, seasoning with salt and spite. The castle's great hall, so proud and echoing in summer, felt cavernous in winter. Fires blazed in enormous hearths, but the warmth never reached the far corners. Banquets looked grand but tasted like survival: salted meat, dried fruit, ale thick as mud. The laughter was polite, the music hollow, the cheer rehearsed. Outside the walls, peasants froze. Inside, they froze more slowly. The difference was mostly ornamental. Yet there was a strange beauty in the austerity. Snow gathered on battlements like lace. The air hung still, filled with the faint hum of prayers from the chapel. The castle became a world of waiting, waiting for spring, for news, for something to break the monotony. Knights grew restless. They practiced swordplay in the courtyard, their breath misting like ghosts. Pages fetched armor polished to a shine no one would see in battle for months. Lords wrote letters to other lords, sealing them with wax that cracked in the cold. Politics, like mold, thrived even when nothing else did. The women of the castle endured differently. They embroidered by candlelight, their eyes straining over endless patterns. They read prayers, played music, gossiped quietly in corners. They knew how to occupy emptiness. Centuries had trained them for it. Some wrote poetry, some plotted marriages, some simply stared out the window at the white landscape and imagined being anywhere else. Sometimes travelers arrived, messengers, monks, beggars, bringing news of the outside world. Each visitor was greeted with the same ritual: a meal, a bed, a dozen questions disguised as courtesy. What is happening beyond these walls? How fares the king? The roads? The world we pretend still exists? When they left, the silence returned heavier than before. The great doors shut, and the wind howled through the arrow slits like a choir of forgotten souls. For all their wealth and stone, castles in winter were no stronger than the cottages below them. They just had better stories to tell about how the cold made them noble. For children, winter was not just cold, it was magic. Terrifying, yes, but also alive in a way adults had forgotten. While their parents cursed the frost, the children laughed at it. They chased snowflakes, made crude sleds from barrels and boards, and declared snowballs the weapons of kings. In their small world, winter was both battlefield and playground. Their laughter carried through the smoke of cottages, thin and bright against the heavy silence of the season. It reminded the old that life hadn't entirely surrendered. You could be starving, shivering, and coughing blood, but still hear a child laugh in the snow, proof that humanity, in its infinite foolishness, hadn't given up yet. Children invented games to fill the endless dark. They carved dolls from twigs, drew faces on lumps of cloth, built fortresses of ice, and named themselves lords of make-believe kingdoms. Their imaginations were the only things that didn't freeze. But winter was cruel even to the young. Many didn't survive their first. Frostbite claimed fingers, hunger thinned them until they looked like ghosts long before death took them. Parents buried them in shallow graves before the ground froze solid, marking the spot with a cross made of sticks. And then, somehow, they went home and kept living. The survivors learned early what the world was, a cycle of brief joy and long endurance. They grew up on stories told by firelight, by mothers with tired voices and fathers too cold to move their hands. The tales were simple: saints, wolves, heroes, fools. Every one ended the same way, the clever or the kind surviving by wit or luck. The lesson was never lost on the children. At night, when the wind screamed against the shutters, they imagined monsters outside, snow spirits, forest ghosts, or witches who stole warmth. The adults never corrected them. Sometimes, lies were more comforting than truth. And yet, even in the heart of the season, children found ways to celebrate. Candlemas brought processions of tiny lights through the village streets, flickering lanterns carried by small hands. It was tradition, but also rebellion, tiny flames daring the darkness to swallow them. They believed in spring before anyone else did. When the first icicle dripped, they were the ones to shout it through the village. When the snow softened, they jumped in puddles before anyone warned them not to. Their hope was reckless and unteachable. The adults pretended not to envy it. They told the children to come inside, to stay near the fire, to behave. But secretly, they listened for the laughter outside. Because as long as someone was laughing, winter hadn't won. In the end, it was the children who kept the world alive. They didn't pray for warmth or curse the cold. They simply played, and in that play was something holier than any sermon, proof that joy could exist without reason, and that hope didn't need permission. Faith in winter wasn't just a comfort, it was survival dressed as ritual. The people of medieval Europe prayed not for prosperity, but for endurance. When the snow buried their fields and the rivers froze, they didn't ask why God was cruel, they asked what they'd done wrong. The priests preached patience from pulpits that smelled of mold and candle smoke. The Lord tests the faithful, they said, while their own hands trembled from cold. The villagers nodded because the alternative, that no one was listening, was too frightening to consider. Every village had its favorite saints, its small army of celestial specialists. Saint Blaise for throats, Saint Apollonia for teeth, Saint Roch for plague, Saint Lawrence for, well, fire. Each had their season, their day, their miracle quota. People built small shrines of sticks and bones, decorated them with scraps of cloth, and whispered prayers that rose into the frozen air like faint smoke. And sometimes, miracles happened. Or seemed to. A fever broke. A lost sheep returned. A roof held through the storm. Proof enough. People didn't need thunder or angels, they needed evidence that the world still had rules. The church understood that. They wrote sermons about frost and famine, turning weather into theology. As the body suffers, so the soul is purified, they said. It was clever, in a way. Turning suffering into virtue meant no one could complain without sounding unholy. But even the devout grew tired. There were nights when prayers felt like talking to ice. Candles sputtered, the air thick with wax smoke, and silence pressed so hard that even faith seemed fragile. People looked at their crucifixes and wondered if Christ ever felt this kind of cold. Yet faith persisted, not the grand cathedral kind, but the small, stubborn version that lived in kitchens and barns. A farmer blessing his ox before plowing. A mother crossing her child's forehead before bed. A monk copying scripture while his fingers bled. These weren't acts of theology, they were acts of resistance. And beneath all of it, older beliefs survived. The church called them pagan, the people called them practical. They still hung herbs above doors, still buried iron nails at thresholds, still greeted the first snow with a whispered charm. Saints and spirits coexisted quietly, sharing the same sky like reluctant neighbors. Then came Epiphany, when the world was supposed to glow with divine revelation. The priest spoke of magi and miracles. The villagers listened and thought of wood to chop, mouths to feed, frost to endure. Faith didn't melt the snow, but it helped them believe the thaw would come. Because in the end, belief wasn't about evidence. It was about endurance. Faith was the candle in a drafty chapel, burning because someone needed it to. And in the endless dark of a medieval winter, that was miracle enough. When winter swallowed the fields, it didn't just erase the crops, it erased the noise. The scythes went silent, the plows sat still, and the laughter that once rolled across the meadows vanished under the snow. The land became a graveyard of summer's promise, and everyone felt its absence. Farmers still went out, though there was little to do. They checked the fences buried under drifts, broke the ice on the water troughs, and stared at the pale sky as if they might read next year's harvest there. The silence of the frozen fields pressed on them like guilt. Every patch of snow-covered earth whispered the same thing: you didn't save enough. The wind scoured the open land, flattening what remained of the stalks. Here and there, crows perched on black stubble, their wings hunched against the cold. They looked like punctuation marks in a letter the earth had stopped writing. People told stories to make sense of it. They said the fields slept, dreaming of green. They said the frost was a kind of blessing, sealing the soil so it could heal. But deep down, everyone knew the truth: the land wasn't sleeping. It was waiting to see who survived long enough to plant again. The peasants' relationship with the earth was intimate, almost brutal. They touched it, bled on it, fed it their dead, and begged it for mercy. In winter, that relationship became one-sided. The land gave nothing back. Still, they visited it, like mourners at a grave. Sometimes, at night, people claimed to see lights moving over the snow, will-o'-the-wisps, the souls of those who had died in the harvest, still walking their furrows. Others said it was just foxfire or trick candles carried by shepherds. But the old ones nodded knowingly. The land remembers, they said. It never forgets who fed it. The barns, once full of grain, now echoed with the rustle of mice. Men counted sacks again and again, hoping the numbers might change. Women stretched flour with ashen water, turning scarcity into craft. Hunger taught invention: soups from bark, bread from roots, flavor from memory. The church spoke of abundance in heaven, but heaven didn't plow or sow. On earth, salvation came from the patient dirt and the people stubborn enough to love it even when it froze solid beneath their feet. And yet, when the first thaw came, the faintest trickle under the ice, it was the farmers who noticed first. They felt it in their bones, the earth softening, loosening its grip. They smiled, not from joy, but from recognition. The cycle was cruel, but it was constant. That was enough. The fields would bloom again. The same men who had cursed the soil would kneel to it once more. That was faith, too, not in God, but in dirt. Kings did not freeze like peasants, or so the songs claimed. But in truth, the throne was no warmer than a cottage bench. Winter crept even into palaces, gliding over marble floors, seeping through velvet and gold. Fire couldn't touch it. Neither could crowns. In royal courts, the season revealed what summer had hidden. The courtiers' painted smiles cracked like ice. The air grew sharp with intrigue, jealousy, and the smell of damp fur. Kings who ruled armies and lords who commanded lands were reduced to pacing men with chapped hands and aching joints. Even divine right looked smaller when you could see your breath fog before your face. The servants whispered that a cold throne was a cursed one. Maybe they were right. Power, like winter, demanded sacrifice. The king's hall might glitter with silver and torches, but behind the spectacle were empty kitchens, thin servants, and nobles who smiled too wide when the monarch coughed. Letters arrived daily from distant estates, complaints of frozen rivers, empty stores, plague outbreaks. Each one was a small disaster written in ink. Kings answered with commands: raise taxes, lower expectations, send prayers. Paper ruled where steel once had. The royal physicians made their rounds, offering the same advice they'd given for centuries: bleed less, eat more, pray harder. Their remedies were as ceremonial as the crown itself. The true healers were the fires and the servants who kept them lit. And yet, court life continued, as it always did. There were feasts, even when the meat was half-rotten. There were dances, though the floors were slick with frost. Musicians played to numb-fingered audiences pretending not to shiver. Etiquette was the last defense against despair. Queens and noblewomen endured the cold differently. Their layers of silk and brocade hid bruises from corsets and chill. They smiled through chattering teeth, exchanged gossip like currency, and wrote poetry about longing that no one dared to read aloud. Behind the curtains, they ruled quietly, arranging alliances, whispering secrets, turning affection into leverage. And through it all, the peasants suffered invisibly beyond the palace walls. Kings declared it a harsh but holy season, as if frostbite were sanctified. The gap between warm rhetoric and cold reality was wide enough to freeze an empire. Some monarchs, the wise ones, knew this. They rode out among their people, cloaked in furs, handing out bread and coins with theatrical benevolence. The peasants bowed and blessed them, even as they whispered that bread was cheaper than justice. The gesture worked anyway. Hope is a performance everyone wants to believe in. When night fell over the castle, the king sat by his hearth, staring into the fire. The flames reflected in the jewels of his crown, bright, trembling, fleeting. He knew the truth his poets never wrote: winter did not bow to kings. It bowed to no one. The sea in winter was both a prison and a promise. For most of the year, it carried ships and stories, merchants with spices, fishermen with songs, pilgrims with hope. But when the cold came, the sea turned traitor. It stiffened, cracked, and closed its grey jaws around the edges of the known world. Ports that once smelled of salt and fish now stank of stillness. The gulls disappeared, the waves grew sluggish, and the masts in the harbor stood like dead trees. Frozen ropes creaked in the wind. Men who had spent their lives on water found themselves stranded on land, walking the docks like ghosts denied their graves. The fishermen were the first to feel it: the hunger, the boredom, the strange emptiness that came when the horizon no longer moved. Their boats sat trapped in ice, nets stiff with frost. Some risked venturing out anyway, hacking through the surface, praying the current still remembered how to be kind. Most never returned. Merchants cursed the season even louder. No trade meant no coin meant no bribes, and no bribes meant the law remembered their names again. Warehouses full of goods stood silent, guarded by men who knew they'd likely be paid in promises. In coastal towns, taverns filled with sailors swapping tales of frozen voyages, half memory, half madness. They spoke of ships trapped for months in drifting ice, of crews burning the masts to stay alive, of ghost lights that danced across the northern waves. One story told of a ship so far north it found a sea that sang when struck by wind. Everyone laughed, but no one said it wasn't true. The church called the frozen sea God's warning. The sailors called it bad luck. The scholars called it winter. They were all right, in their own ways. Still, some men saw opportunity. When the ice held steady, they built makeshift roads over it, hauling goods across frozen channels by sled, turning danger into commerce. The first to attempt it were either brave or hungry. By the end of the season, everyone followed. Humanity had a habit of naming recklessness innovation. And far beyond, in the north, the sea became something holy. The monks of remote islands wrote of it as the boundary between worlds, a mirror of heaven, beautiful and merciless. They described its silence in poetry and its cruelty in prayer. One monk wrote, "The sea in winter is the face of God, turned away." When spring finally came, the ice broke like glass under a hammer. The sound carried for miles, a thunderclap announcing the world's reopening. Ships launched again, sailors shouted, ropes creaked, and the sea, pretending innocence, returned to life. But the wise remembered what it had been. The sea had frozen once, and it would again. Everything did. The end of winter didn't come with fanfare. It crept in quietly, a drip from the roof, a bird's call at dawn, the faint smell of rot returning to the air. The world began to move again, not in triumph, but in exhaustion. The thaw was not rebirth, it was recovery. The first thing to return was the sound. Water dripping, branches creaking, the low groan of rivers remembering how to flow. Villagers paused their work just to listen, the music of melting. To ears that had endured months of silence and wind, it was as beautiful as any hymn. Then came the mud. Endless, unavoidable, clinging mud. It swallowed roads, devoured shoes, and tested tempers. But no one cursed it too much. Mud meant warmth. Mud meant life. The earth was loosening its grip on the dead season, even if it made a mess of everything in the process. The snow retreated in tatters, revealing what had been hidden: broken tools, bones of animals, the black scars of old fires. Children poked at them with sticks while parents looked away, pretending not to see the reminders of what winter had taken. Forgetting was easier in sunlight. Rivers swelled with melted fury, flooding fields, tearing bridges, and drowning fences. Farmers watched helplessly, knowing that destruction was just the price of renewal. Let the water take what it must, they said, so the earth may give again. There was no bitterness in the saying, just experience. The air smelled different now, sweet and sour, like decay and promise. Smoke thinned from chimneys, replaced by the smell of damp soil. Birds returned in noisy flocks, arguing loudly as if reclaiming their sky. The first flowers appeared, fragile and defiant, blooming in mud like tiny acts of courage. People shed layers, of clothing, of silence, of fear. They spoke more, sang more, even argued more. Life had sound again. The markets reopened, laughter echoed through the streets, and for the first time in months, no one spoke about death unless it was to compare it to the weather. But the thaw wasn't kind to everyone. For some, it came too late. Graves thawed before hearts did. The living mourned, the priests blessed, and the world kept going. Renewal was never fair, it was just relentless. And yet, the rhythm returned. The plows dug into soft earth, seeds were scattered like prayers, and fires burned only for warmth, not survival. The sky turned blue again, the kind of blue people forget exists when the world is gray too long. The thaw didn't erase the memory of winter. It didn't need to. The memory itself was part of the cycle, a reminder that everything hard, everything frozen, eventually yields. And so they worked, and sang, and hoped, not because they believed the next winter would be easier, but because they knew it would come, and they would face it again. That was the quiet victory of humanity, not escape, but return. When the fields turned green again, the people of medieval Europe did what they always did. They talked about winter as if it had happened to someone else. Memory softened it. The frost became sharp, the storms unforgiving, the hunger humbling. Words turned misery into legend, and legend into wisdom. It was how they kept the horror from turning into despair. Stories bloomed faster than the first wildflowers. In the tavern, men bragged about the coldest night they'd survived, the wolves they'd scared off, the roofs they'd patched while the wind screamed like the devil himself. In cottages, mothers told children tales of frost spirits who froze liars' tongues, saints who walked barefoot across ice, and kings who learned humility when their wine turned solid in its cup. Every winter became a teacher, every survivor a student. They learned how to store grain, how to seal roofs, how to read the air before snow. But more importantly, they learned how to hope without reason, a skill as necessary as fire. Monks wrote it all down, of course. Not the jokes or the fears, but the facts. A great frost came upon the land, they would record. The people suffered. No adjectives, no details, just the truth as a ghost might tell it, distant and without warmth. The real history of winter lived not in ink, but in the quiet sighs of those who remembered it firsthand. Children grew up hearing the stories and thinking them exaggerated. They laughed when elders warned of the winter of the black frost or the year the river froze to the sea. But when their turn came, they told the same stories, and added their own. That's how history works when it's cold. It repeats until you learn to stop being surprised. The memory of winter wasn't just about suffering. It shaped everything, the rhythm of work, the pace of prayer, the way people loved each other. Lovers clung tighter when the nights grew long. Families ate from one pot, huddled for warmth, argued, forgave. The cold stripped life of pretense, leaving only what mattered. Even the nobles remembered, though they disguised their lessons as poetry. The frost humbles the proud, one wrote. It teaches silence to kings. He probably wrote it beside a roaring fire, wrapped in fur, but that didn't make it less true. And when the first snow of the next winter finally fell, soft, quiet, almost tender, no one cursed. They just nodded. The old rhythm had returned, and so had they. They would gather wood again, patch roofs again, pray again, laugh again. Because in the great, endless circle of hunger and thaw, death and fire, fear and song, the people of medieval Europe had learned the oldest truth of all. Winter was not the enemy. It was the mirror, showing them who they really were when everything else was gone. And somehow, they never looked away. When the night stretched longer than memory, people began to talk to the dark. Not out loud at first, just in thoughts whispered like steam against frozen air. The cold didn't only numb fingers, it reached deeper, slowing the mind until it began inventing warmth. Loneliness was a fact of life in the Middle Ages, but winter sharpened it into madness. Shepherds claimed to hear voices in the snow, not screams, not cries, but soft, insistent murmurs that seemed to come from beneath the ice. Travelers swore they saw figures walking beside them, matching their footsteps exactly. Most didn't tell anyone until spring, afraid of being called touched or cursed. But everyone understood. They'd all heard something once. In villages, solitude crept in like smoke. Families too poor for candles sat in darkness together, each person drifting into their own thoughts. The silence between them grew so heavy it became a kind of company. Some prayed. Others sang under their breath, the same short songs repeated until the words stopped meaning anything. Sleep played tricks too. People dreamed of warmth so vivid it hurt to wake. Some even died smiling, still trapped inside their dreams of summer. The priests called it the gentle passing. The villagers called it mercy. Monks were not immune either. In their isolated cloisters, fasting and freezing, some claimed to see angels carved from frost or devils in the candle smoke. Their diaries described both with the same calm tone, as if faith and hallucination were merely neighbors visiting each other's houses. Fear changed shape in the cold. It wasn't sudden or violent. It was slow and persuasive, whispering, "Maybe you won't see spring this time." The danger wasn't just dying. It was believing that dying would be easier than enduring another night. And yet, even in that darkness, people found ways to stay tethered to life. They told stories aloud to keep their voices in use. They scratched marks on walls to count the days. They whispered names of loved ones, not as prayers but as proof they still existed. When the thaw finally came, many avoided speaking of what they'd felt. It was superstition, yes, but also shame. No one wanted to admit that they'd heard whispers in the snow and almost answered back. Because deep down, everyone knew that the cold didn't just freeze the body. It revealed the mind's cracks, the ones that were always there, waiting under the surface. Fire wasn't just heat in the Middle Ages, it was existence itself. Every home, from the peasant's hut to the stone castle, revolved around a single fragile flame. To lose it was to be exiled from life. That's why people treated fire not as a tool, but as a guest, volatile, divine, always hungry. The hearth was the heart of the household, both altar and battlefield. Women guarded it as fiercely as soldiers guarded city walls. They banked the embers under ash before bed, whispered charms to keep them alive, and rose before dawn to coax the faintest glow back to life. It was a daily resurrection, a quiet miracle no one wrote down. There were tricks to it, knowledge passed from mothers to daughters. The best kindling was birch bark or dried moss, oak burned steady, pine too fast. Every spark had its character. The wrong wood filled the house with smoke thick enough to choke the prayers from your lungs. The right one made the flames dance clear and blue, like they approved of you. When a fire went out, it wasn't just inconvenience, it was shame. A cold hearth meant failure. Neighbors would see no smoke rising and know your luck had turned. People walked miles to borrow flame from another house, carrying it in pots wrapped in rags like a newborn. The fire's return was celebrated with bread and blessings, as if a prodigal child had come home. In monasteries, fire was both luxury and sin. The rule of Saint Benedict warned against indulgence, but even piety bends to frostbite. The monks kept the flames small, the rooms colder than honesty. They claimed it built discipline, the novices called it suffering with good manners. Still, they tended their lamps as carefully as their souls. The sacred flame burned not just in the chapel but in every small act of endurance. Fire-making itself bordered on sorcery. Flint and steel were precious, tinder was hoarded like treasure. Sparks were fickle things, sometimes taking easily, sometimes refusing every plea. A skilled firekeeper could coax flame from almost nothing, and people swore that certain hands simply knew how to charm it. There were rituals too, pagan echoes wrapped in Christian language. Some spat into the hearth for luck, others whispered the names of saints before striking a spark. A few swore the flame had moods, that it could sense fear or anger. When a fire sputtered out suddenly, people didn't just curse, they crossed themselves. And at night, when the household slept, one person always stayed half awake, listening to the hiss and pop of the embers. That sound was the closest thing to comfort the medieval world allowed. A steady crackle meant the world still turned, that warmth still existed somewhere between dream and dawn. When the fire burned too low, someone stirred it gently, not wanting to wake the others. The embers glowed, sighed, and brightened again, a small defiance in a vast, uncaring winter. And that was how people survived, not by strength or faith alone, but by keeping one stubborn spark alive, night after night, century after century. Winter made death honest. In the warmer months, you could hide it, bury the body quickly, light candles, let the soil swallow the truth. But when the ground froze like iron, death lingered. It waited in corners, in barns, in cellars, until the thaw came to finish what the living could not. In small villages, the churchyard was a frozen silence. The graves stood like trapped breath under snow, the crosses bowed beneath white weight. When someone died, the living gathered anyway, huddled in cloaks, their tears turning to ice before they reached the ground. They couldn't dig, so they did what necessity demanded, wrapped the body tight, stored it in sheds or shallow caves, and prayed that animals or time would leave it untouched. No one liked to speak of the waiting dead, but everyone had seen them. Wrapped in linen or wool, stacked like sacks of grain in barns, guarded by candles that flickered and died in drafts. It wasn't cruelty, it was logistics. The priest would bless the bodies each week, just to remind God they were still claimed. The church bells rang softer in winter, as if sound itself moved slower. Funerals were brief, words lost in the wind, hymns cut short by shivering. The living hurried back to the fires, leaving footprints that filled with snow before the echoes stopped. Monks kept records of each passing, written in a hand that looked too calm for the subject. Died of hunger. Fell through ice. Did not wake. The words repeated across pages, line after line, like a chant. The scribes never added feeling, they didn't need to. The repetition spoke enough. For all the misery, there was beauty in how they remembered their dead. Candles burned through the night, small golden lights flickering in cottage windows. Families left bread on doorsteps, a gesture for wandering souls. Some whispered that on certain nights, when the snow glowed blue and the wind was still, the dead passed by their homes, checking that the living still kept warm. Children feared those nights and yet hoped to glimpse a familiar face. They'd peek from under blankets, swearing later they saw a shadow pause outside, just long enough to listen. Parents didn't argue. Some comforts aren't meant to be corrected. In the larger towns, grave diggers became winter's most patient workers. They hacked at frozen ground with picks and hammers, sweating through layers of wool. The earth resisted every blow. Sometimes they gave up, setting fires on the ground to soften it. The smoke mixed with incense during burial, creating a smell the priests called holy and the diggers called tolerable. Death in winter was not tragedy, it was rhythm. Everyone expected it, planned for it, even joked about it when the ale ran strong. The snow will take who it wants, they said, and leave the rest to argue. But when spring returned and the burials finally began, the grief came late and heavy. The soil thawed, the bells rang loud again, and the people carried their dead one by one to the earth. Some prayed, some cursed, some simply watched the ground swallow the shape they loved. And then they went home, tended the fires, and spoke of the dead as if they still listened, which, in some way, they did. Because in winter, nothing ever truly left. It just waited for the thaw. Winter taught patience better than any sermon. It had no interest in comfort, no concern for progress. It simply was, and humanity had to bend to its rhythm or break against it. In a world without clocks or calendars worth trusting, people learned time through endurance, through waiting. There was waiting for warmth, waiting for light, waiting for the day the river cracked open again and fish returned to the nets. Waiting became the season's true labor, and everyone worked at it in their own way. Peasants repaired tools they wouldn't use for months, sharpening blades and mending handles with slow, deliberate care. Women spun wool until their fingers ached, twisting thread like time itself. Monks copied pages by candlelight, letters forming in rhythm with their own breath. They weren't rushing toward spring, they were surviving the seconds. The young despised it. They wanted noise, movement, anything that proved the world hadn't stopped. They invented tasks, meaningless chores, and foolish dares just to break the monotony. The elders smiled at their impatience. They knew time didn't need help, it moved even when you didn't. In castles, nobles grew restless. Hunts were impossible, wars postponed, feasts dull. Courtiers whispered louder, hoping intrigue might thaw the boredom. Kings and queens wrote letters that said nothing but filled pages anyway, the medieval version of pacing. Even power, it turned out, could freeze. But the poor understood waiting as craft. They counted time in wood piles, in candle stubs, in the distance between hunger and the next loaf. They didn't expect spring to save them, they expected it to test whether they deserved it. Patience wasn't passive. It was active, stubborn work, holding on when nothing changed, when nothing promised to. The saints said it was virtue, the peasants called it necessity. Either way, it kept them alive. And winter offered strange gifts to those who mastered it. In the long quiet, people saw things they missed in the noise of summer, the shape of smoke rising from the hearth, the subtle creak of the roof in wind, the way snow turned the world into light and shadow. Waiting sharpened the senses until even stillness became an event. Children learned from watching. They saw their parents move slowly but surely, never wasting motion. They learned that some tasks, like surviving, had no shortcuts. They learned that patience was not weakness, but endurance disguised as calm. When spring finally came, it wasn't joy they felt first, but disbelief. After so many weeks of counting days, the sudden rush of melting water felt indecent, almost rude. People didn't cheer, they exhaled. The waiting was over, but its lesson stayed. In every cottage, every monastery, every frozen field, the same truth echoed quietly: winter wasn't about hunger or hardship. It was about learning to exist when the world refused to move. The patience of winter was not submission. It was defiance, the slow, steady refusal to disappear. When the frost finally began to loosen its grip, the first sign of change wasn't seen, it was heard. The church bells, long silent or muffled by snow, began to ring again. Not in celebration, but in relief. The sound cut through the air like sunlight through fog. For months, the bells had been quiet. Their silence had felt holy at first, then heavy, then wrong. Now, with each toll, people remembered what rhythm felt like: time moving again, the world waking from its long stillness. The priests emerged from their cold stone sanctuaries blinking at the light, as if God himself had just remembered them. They opened doors swollen with ice and watched the villagers file in, coughing, thin, pale as wax. Confession came first. It always did. The people lined up to speak their sins, some ordinary, some strange. They confessed stealing firewood, cursing neighbors, doubting God, hating the cold. One man whispered that he'd prayed not for warmth, but for others to freeze faster. The priest nodded, said his penance, and didn't look surprised. Winter did that to people. The church smelled of damp and smoke, the air thick with human breath. Candles flickered in their sconces, the wax bending like tired knees. The sound of prayer arose, hesitant at first, then swelling until it filled the rafters. The echoes made even small voices sound eternal. In the corner, children played with bits of melting ice, laughing softly until their mothers hushed them. Even laughter felt like blasphemy after such a long silence. The monks in the choir sang again, their voices cracked from disuse. The Latin rolled slow and heavy, a chant that didn't praise spring but simply acknowledged it. Faith, like the season, had survived out of habit more than joy. Outside, the churchyard was softening. Graves that had been sealed under snow began to sag, the earth breathing again. The bells tolled for the dead, as they always did, one long note for the body, one shorter for the soul. For all its ritual, the church had learned the same lesson as the peasants: waiting is worship. The cold had stripped away ornament and pride until only endurance remained. And as the bells rang again, the people listened not for God's voice, but for their own. When the frost cracked and the roads began to breathe again, Europe started to move. For months, the world had been reduced to stillness, villages closed off like islands, merchants trapped behind snow, carts frozen in place. But the thaw did what kings and prayers could not: it reconnected the land. The first sound of trade returning wasn't shouting or hammering. It was the slow creak of cartwheels finding mud instead of ice. Men leaned into their loads with the relief of motion, swearing fondly at the ruts. Movement meant life again. Merchants were the first to emerge, wrapped in cloaks still lined with frost. They arrived in towns half empty, where people greeted them like prophets. Markets reopened not with fanfare but with hunger, stalls overflowing with whatever survived the winter: salt fish, dried herbs, the first green shoots. Prices soared, then argued themselves back down. Coins clinked again, an almost forgotten sound. It carried through the air like laughter. For months, the only music had been wind and bells. Now there was barter, the rhythm of need meeting supply. A villager traded a fur cloak for grain, a farmer swapped seed for salt, a widow bartered the last of her honey for boots. Commerce was religion in motion. But trade was more than goods, it was gossip. Travelers brought stories along with wares, tales of neighboring villages, of king's decrees, of saints' relics discovered under snow. People listened wide-eyed, hungry for anything beyond their walls. The market became the heart of spring, noisy, alive, a pulse returning to the frozen body of the world. The smell changed too. After months of smoke and damp wool, the air now carried the tang of leather, sweat, and fresh-cut wood. Bakers returned to their ovens, the scent of bread replacing that of ashes. Children chased chickens through the mud, laughing so loudly it felt like defiance. Money was never honest, but it was hopeful. Each exchange was a small declaration that the world would continue, that the frost hadn't broken its promise entirely. The church warned against greed, but even the priests couldn't resist the bustle of the market. They stood in doorways, listening to the music of coin and conversation, and quietly blessed the noise. Still, the scars of winter lingered. Some stalls were empty. Some merchants didn't return. Trade routes shifted with every frost and thaw, like veins in the earth. But the living carried on, patching what had cracked, selling what they could, pretending the losses were smaller than they were. As the roads cleared farther, the world expanded again. Ships left their harbors, carts rolled across borders, and voices in a dozen languages filled the towns. After so long in silence, humanity seemed to remember itself all at once. Trade didn't just bring wealth, it brought proof that the world was still connected, that across the snow and the centuries, people were still reaching for one another. And so, under banners still stained from winter's soot, the markets filled with light, sound, and motion once more, 1,000 small transactions, each one an act of faith that spring would last. The first true feast after winter was never about abundance, it was about relief. 4 months, the people of medieval Europe had eaten like ghosts, living off roots, grain dust, and prayer. When spring finally came, and the stores cracked open, every mouthful became a ceremony. Bread was the first miracle. The smell of it baking filled the villages like a hymn, drifting through door cracks and across muddy streets. People followed it as if it were divine. The loaves were small and coarse, half barley, half hope, but when they came out of the oven golden and steaming, it felt like a second sunrise. Meat followed, though not much of it. A chicken, maybe 2. A rabbit snared by luck or skill. Even the poorest households roasted something, not because they could spare it, but because celebration needed to be tasted to be real. They shared what they had, passing plates that held more gratitude than food. The first greens, sorrel, nettles, dandelion, appeared beside the roads, and people gathered them with reverence. They weren't just food, they were proof that the earth still loved them. Monks wrote that eating greens after Lent was a renewal of the flesh. The peasants just called it living again. In larger towns, the feast became spectacle. Markets overflowed, taverns reopened, and ale flowed until songs replaced words. Fiddlers played, drums echoed on the cobbles, and laughter, rough, unsteady, but real, filled the air. People didn't toast to wealth or glory, they toasted to warmth, to breath, to each other. Even the nobles joined in their own way. They held banquets that lasted days, though half their guests still looked gaunt beneath the candlelight. Their tables groaned with salted fish, stewed fruit, and spiced wine. But beneath the performance, everyone knew, hunger had touched every rank. The feast wasn't just pleasure, it was proof of survival. The church, too, took part. Priests led prayers of thanks, praising God for sparing those who endured. But even they seemed less solemn and more human in the thaw. After all, even saints ate bread. For a brief time, there were no classes, no sins, no debts, only the simple joy of chewing something warm. Mothers fed children from the same bowl, husbands and wives shared crusts without counting. Gratitude tasted like smoke and salt, but it was sweeter than anything gold could buy. And yet, as with all things, the joy was fleeting. The fields needed plowing, the roof still leaked, the cold would return again. The feast was a pause, a deep breath before the work resumed. People knew that. Maybe that's what made it so sacred. When night fell, fires burned in the streets and songs carried over the hills. They weren't the polished hymns of church choirs, but rough, human songs, about frost and faith and foolish luck. Some mourned the lost, others simply hummed, eyes closed, full at last. The next morning, the bread was gone, the plate scraped clean, and the world began again. But for one night, they had tasted victory. And it was enough. Winter had drained the world of color. For months, everything existed in shades of gray, white, and brown, as if life itself had been reduced to a sketch. Then, slowly, pigment returned. The thaw brought not only warmth but hue, and with it, the forgotten instinct to create. The first splash of color came from the earth. Moss glowed green between stones, crocuses stabbed through the soil in violet defiance, and the river shimmered blue again. To eyes that had known only frost and smoke, it was almost overwhelming, too bright, too alive. Some villagers said it hurt to look at spring. Clothing changed first. The heavy furs and wool cloaks of winter were set aside, patched, and stored for the next ordeal. In their place came color, reds from madder, yellows from saffron, blues from woad. The dyes were imperfect, uneven, prone to fading, but no one cared. After months of blending into the landscape, people wanted to be seen. The peasants' tunics brightened, the nobles' garments blazed. Even in the poorest households, a scrap of dyed cloth, a ribbon, or a patch of color sewn onto a sleeve was enough to declare, "We survived." Artists returned to their craft as though waking from a shared dream. Monks in scriptoria mixed fresh inks, their fingers stained with blue and gold. Painters scraped old panels and began again, their saints and angels blooming with renewed vibrance. Color was devotion, proof that beauty still had a place in a world that had spent so long surviving instead of living. In churches, stained glass caught the lengthening sunlight again, painting floors in rubies and sapphires. The people who stood beneath it felt as if heaven itself had remembered them. For a moment, the cold seemed to have been only a story. Music followed the color. Where winter had been silent, now came melody. Fiddles, flutes, the rhythm of bare feet on thawed earth. Songs weren't written down, they didn't need to be. They spread by memory, carried on wind and laughter. Every note was a rebellion against silence. Even food looked different. Where winter had been gray stews and pale bread, spring offered green herbs, yellow cheese, red apples. People decorated their tables not out of vanity, but gratitude. A sprig of flowers in a cup, a colored cloth on the table, it wasn't luxury, it was healing. Love, too, found color again. Weddings that had been postponed through the frost finally took place. The brides wore garlands of wildflowers, the grooms polished their boots until they caught the sun. Rings were exchanged, promises made, and for once, no one mentioned death. But beneath the joy was something softer, the awareness that color was temporary. Everyone knew it would fade, wash out, darken again when the next frost came. That knowledge made it all the more precious. The monks wrote that beauty was a glimpse of paradise. The peasants believed it was proof they hadn't been forgotten. Either way, color had returned, and with it, meaning. When the last snow melted on the mountains, the rivers reflected a sky so blue it looked new. And for a brief, impossible moment, the world felt whole again. When spring truly settled and the roads lost their frost, the world began to move again. After months of confinement, travel itself felt holy. The mud was thick, the ruts deep, and every step uncertain, but no one cared. The simple act of walking beneath a sky that didn't threaten snow was enough to feel reborn. The roads, once silent, filled with voices again. Merchants with carts, monks on foot, peasants carrying bundles. all following the same long ribbons of dirt that stitched the world back together. Even pilgrims, who had spent the winter trapped by the weather, took to the paths once more, convinced that movement was prayer made visible. The first travelers to appear in a village were always surrounded by curiosity. Children ran beside them, staring at their boots caked with foreign mud. Adults asked questions about distant towns, kings' wars, the price of salt, all delivered in one breath. The traveler answered what they could, exaggerating when the truth was dull. After all, stories were the real currency of the road. The inns reopened, too, their shutters creaking as if waking from dreams. The smell of beer returned, the benches filled, and for the first time in months, people gathered without fear. The talk was loud, the laughter louder, the warmth immediate. The innkeeper, polishing mugs with tired pride, knew that as long as the roads were open, the world still made sense. But not all travelers walked for trade or pleasure. Many walked for penance. The church encouraged pilgrimage after harsh winters, a cleansing of the soul to match the thawing of the earth. They walked to shrines and relics, barefoot or bleeding, carrying burdens they couldn't name aloud. Along the way, they shared crusts of bread, wine, and silence. The road became confession. For others, it was a different kind of homecoming. Soldiers returned from distant campaigns to find their fields overgrown. Widows followed roads to find news of husbands lost to war or cold. Apprentices, grown restless, sought new masters in other towns. The roads carried not only feet, but hope and regret in equal measure. There were dangers, of course. Bandits never hibernated. Wolves still lingered near the forest's edge. But the thaw made courage cheap. People traveled anyway, trusting in luck, saints, and the company of strangers. And so, the roads became alive again, arteries through which the world's pulse returned. Every traveler carried more than goods. They carried proof that winter had not broken the human will to wander. The monks wrote about this annual migration, calling it a vitae, the journey of life. They believed that all travel, even the smallest errand, was a reflection of the soul's pilgrimage through hardship toward grace. The peasants, less poetic, simply said, "When the mud dries, we go." By mid-spring, the world was noisy again. Bells from distant towns carried on the wind, mingling with songs from travelers and the creak of wagons. The stillness of winter faded, leaving behind a rhythm older than any kingdom. For every road led somewhere, and, more importantly, led back. When the final leaves fell and the air turned sharp again, no one in medieval Europe was surprised. Winter never arrived. It returned, like an old creditor come to collect. People didn't dread it anymore. They simply acknowledged it, the way one acknowledges gravity. The first frost was a warning and a promise all at once. By then, they'd already prepared. Roofs patched, food buried in cellars, animals herded close to the hearth. They had learned, over generations, how to greet the cold not as an enemy, but as an inevitable guest, unpleasant, but necessary. Winter, after all, gave meaning to every other season. Without it, spring would have been just weather. As snow began to fall again, the rhythm restarted. Wood stacked, fires fed, prayers whispered. Children still laughed at the first snowflake, their parents still sighed at the same sight. Some things, even in hardship, never lost their beauty. The world slowed. The sun hung low, brief and tired. Days folded into one another like pages in a worn book. The long night stretched ahead, quiet, heavy, full of small sounds, the hiss of logs, the murmur of sleepers, the groan of timbers under ice. People told stories again. The same ones, reshaped a little each year. Of saints who tamed frost demons, of wolves who spoke in men's voices, of spirits who wandered the snow asking for warmth. The stories weren't entertainment, they were survival. They filled the silence so it couldn't fill you. In the cities, candles burned in windows through the dark hours. In villages, firelight bled through cracks in the wood, tiny stars scattered across the land. Travelers looking from afar could mistake them for constellations fallen to earth. And as the months passed, the rhythm of endurance took over once more. The people did what they'd always done. They worked, they waited, they loved where they could. There was no triumph in it, but there was dignity, a quiet acceptance that to live meant to keep moving through the cold, no matter how deep it bit. Monks wrote again in their ledgers, the winter was long. The people suffered. The Lord provided. It was always written that way, brief, factual, stripped of emotion. But between those lines lived everything unsaid, the laughter, the hunger, the small mercies that made endurance possible. And so the cycle continued. Spring would come, then summer, then harvest, then frost again. Life didn't fight it. It moved with it, like breath between heartbeats. If you stood outside on a clear night in those centuries, really stood still until the cold touched bone, you could almost hear it. The sound of an entire world breathing through the winter. Slow, tired, alive. And perhaps that's the secret they understood better than we do now. Survival was never about conquering the cold. It was about keeping something warm inside long enough for the thaw to find it. A single spark in the ash. A story told again by firelight. A breath that refuses to stop. That's all they had. And somehow, it was enough.